Hi, I'm Mr. Nance, and today we're talking about Scarlet Letter, one of my favorite books. And I'll call this section Good Beginnings, because that's what it's all about. The Scarlet Letter is not the easiest book in the world to read, even if you really like reading. It's best read with other people, or studied in class, because you can get other people's opinions, and you can sort of get to see some of the cool stuff about the book. But on your own, it presents some challenges. Nathaniel Hawthorne can be a bit of a challenge for 3 reasons. First of all, his language is complex and old. Second of all, he's really obsessed with symbolism. And third, his pacing is, well, not blockbuster hit. These 3 aspects can be particularly frustrating for a student of Nathaniel Hawthorne, and so we're going to try to address them today, particularly looking at the question of where do we start? So let's look at our books. First of all, most of the yearbooks start with a section called The Custom House, which is an explanation of where Nathaniel Hawthorne got the idea for the story. I recommend, unless you're just really interested, don't read that. Go straight to chapter 1, which is actually not much of a thriller either. There's no explosions, no big dramatic action. In fact, there aren't even any characters in chapter 1. All that happens, we get a bit of setting, we look really closely at a big door, and some flowers. In case you are interested, The Custom House is about Nathaniel Hawthorne working at a custom house, which is a tax office, basically. And it's how he finds in the old attic, among a bunch of records, the actual Scarlet Letter, and that causes him to write the story. It's pretty funny, it's kind of entertaining, but really not a good place to start if you aren't super into the Scarlet Letter already. Maybe read it later. So in spite of the fact that chapter 1 is kind of frustrating to people because nothing happens in it, I would like to put forth that it is an excellent first chapter, if you know why it's there. So we're going to try to answer the question, why? Before we can answer why chapter 1 is important, we have to answer a couple of other questions. What makes a beginning good? And what's the point of a beginning? Thomas C. Foster, the author of How to Read Literature Like a Professor, also wrote a book called How to Read Novels Like a Professor. And in his first chapter, he talks about what happens in the very first page of a novel. How the first page seems to set the pace for the whole novel and teach the reader how to read it. In fact, he goes on to talk about 18 different things that you can discover from the very first page of the novel. He says that this is a law of getting started. The opening is the first lesson in how to read the novel. So now, let's look at the book itself. What is Nathaniel Hawthorne trying to teach us in chapter 1? Well, the first thing we notice probably is that chapter 1 is really short. In fact, that's it. Turn the page and you're at chapter 2. Why is this chapter so short? The second thing we notice is that there are absolutely no characters. Well, none to speak of in chapter 1. We start with a throng of bearded men, but they instantly disappear in front of a door. And all we see for most of the rest of the chapter is the door. And then we end with a rose bush. You probably noticed that because there are no characters, only objects, they're probably heavily fraught with symbolism. Symbolism is one of Nathaniel Hawthorne's biggest tricks. He loves it. He gushes about symbolism. In fact, he really likes to make it abundantly obvious in his book that he's including symbolism. Let me give you an example. In one of his books, House of Seven Gables, he includes a bunch of dilapidated chickens that represent the way the family has deteriorated over time. And basically in every single scene, the chickens show back up, just wandering around the yard, and you begin to get more and more tired of the chickens until finally you begin to scream, I get it already. I understand the chickens represent the dilapidated family and how they've deteriorated over the years. In the Scarlet Letter, the most important symbol is, of course, the Scarlet Letter itself, but there are lots of other symbols. And we get introduced to the idea of symbolism in chapter 1. As chapter 1 doesn't include any action, it only includes symbolism. We begin to see how significant symbolism is to this book, and how it's going to really set the whole pace for the book and help us to understand the whole book. The other important technique that's established in chapter 1 is the language of Nathaniel Hawthorne. We see how complex his language is, and part of it's because, well, his writing was around a while ago. But the word choice that he chooses is rather complicated. The term for word choice that we use here is diction. Some of the words he chooses in the very first paragraph: throng, edifice, words that we probably know what they mean, or at least could guess pretty easily at, but make it feel a bit old. They aren't words that we'd necessarily use in everyday language. And later on we're going to see that he's going to use words like ignominy, sometimes 10 times a page. This diction sets the book apart. It makes it special. It feels old. Not necessarily old in a way that's bad, but old in sort of a foreign or almost exotic kind of way. It's the past of our country, the U.S., but at the same time, it's distant. It's romantic. More on romanticism later, but trust me, exotic and far away is definitely romantic. Like Once Upon a Time, in a land far, far away. We notice one other big thing here: pacing. Nathaniel Hawthorne certainly isn't in a hurry to write this book, or to get it going. Considering that nothing happens in chapter 1, we kind of get the idea that he's going to take his time, and really pay attention to every detail as we go. And that's going to be important. We got to realize that this book is not about action, necessarily, as it is about reflection, and about what we make of action. That's going to be really important, because the most important thing that happens in this book actually happens before the book begins, and the rest of the book is how we deal with that one action, that one big mistake. So chapter 1 introduces us to symbolism, it introduces us to the diction and the pacing, but what does it actually say? What actually happens in chapter 1, and why does chapter 1 matter? Well, it starts with a throng of bearded men, and it describes them. They're pretty depressing, and so are the women. They all seem sort of cold and hard. We get even more description of them in the next chapter. But we quickly leave the people, and we move to the door. And the door is really what the book centers about, the chapter centers about, We move on to a description of why there happens to be a door here in the first place. This is a prison door. And the book says, the founders of a new colony, whatever utopia of human virtue and happiness they might originally project, have invariably recognized it among their earliest practical necessities to allot a portion of the virgin soil as a cemetery, and another portion as the site of a prison. This is a pretty harsh beginning. It establishes a set of characters who have ideals, but whose ideals have already failed by the time we get to the book. We don't have a whole lot of sympathy for this group of people. They're cold, they're hard, and their ideals have already failed. Hawthorne goes on to describe the door in more detail, and this is where the symbolism starts to kick in. Certain it is that, some 15 or 20 years after the settlement of the town, the wooden jail was already marked with weather stains and other indications of age, which gave a yet darker aspect to its beetle-browed and gloomy front. Like all that pertains to crime, it seemed never to have known a youthful era. Very quickly we see that this book demonstrates and establishes a dark, depressing, and doomsday kind of opening. Everything is bad. Even the things that we thought were ideal have faded away, and we realize that this door shows us that human frailty is everywhere, that humans make mistakes, and there's no escaping from them. They're going to haunt you no matter where in the world you go. The door shows us there will always be crime. There will always be bad. There will always be evil. And it's pretty depressing. Furthermore, growing next to the door is a bunch of unsightly vegetation. It's nasty. It's rank. It's gross. But then, in the middle of it, on one side of the portal, and rooted almost at the threshold, was a wild rose bush, covered in this month of June with its delicate gems, which might be imagined to offer their fragrance and fragile beauty to the prisoner as he went in, and to the condemned criminal as he came forth to his doom, in token that the deep heart of nature could pity and be kind to them. So this is going to be a story about evil, dark, depressing doom, prison door, but that's not the only thing here. There's something else growing up. This rose bush adds a new element to the story and adds something much more important here. Something of beauty and something of hope. He ends chapter 1 saying, "Finding it so directly on the threshold of our narrative, which is now about to issue from that inauspicious portal, we could hardly do otherwise than to pluck one of its flowers and present it to the reader. It may serve, let us hope, to symbolize some sweet moral blossom that may be found along the track, or relieve the darkening close of a tale of human frailty and sorrow." We get a good sense of narrative style in this passage because Nathaniel Hawthorne, as a narrator, pops out of his story to hand the reader a rose, saying, "Hey, take this, it might be important to you." He says this story is going to be a tale of human frailty and sorrow, so take this rose, and hopefully it'll symbolize some sweet moral blossom, something that will relieve the darkening close. So we know what to expect. This story is going to be about human frailty and sorrow. It's going to have a lot of sad things in it, but ultimately, it's also going to have something sweet in it. And Nathaniel Hawthorne goes out of his way to point out that that's what we need to be paying attention to. This kind of opening isn't unheard of. Later on, when we read Faust, Goethe is going to introduce in his prologue a little speech that tells the reader what to pay attention to in the story, what to focus on. It's the narrator saying, "Hey, listen, here's my story. This is what you need to look at." As you're reading the Scarlet Letter, don't get distracted by the gloom. Remember, there's something good and something hopeful hidden in everything here. Be paying attention to it. Nathaniel Hawthorne tells you to. Look out for that bit of hope shining through it all, that beauty that's there in the darkness. And that's part of what makes this book so great. More next time.